Okay, so we've just ticked over 5 o'clock, so welcome everyone. This is the Downtown Law and Business webinar that we run most months for the Ross Parsons Centre for Commercial, Corporate and Taxation Law here at Sydney Law School. My name is Jason Harris. I'm Professor of Corporate Law here at Sydney Law School. And tonight I'm delighted to present two presenters to you, and we're going to be discussing the issue of boards and artificial intelligence. Now, this is the first in a planned series of webinars that will look at the issue of technology and corporate law, and so we'll be releasing more details about the future webinars in that series. I thought I'd pick this as the first topic because AI is such a buzzword at the moment and has been for quite a long period of time. It's pretty much every day in the newspapers there's some story about AI, and we've been hearing quite a lot about how AI is being used within companies, should be used within companies, and how boards might use it. AI, of course, is just an umbrella term for a variety of different technologies. And the second slide that I've got here, which is the well-known Gartner hype cycle. Of course, Gartner publishes a number of these every year. This is the particular one for AI. There's a broad range of different forms of technology that they put within the AI umbrella term. Now, this is only a 1-hour webinar. We're not going to be able to delve into most of those different types of technologies, but hopefully what we will be able to do in this session is talk about how boards can use AI to better do their job. The performance of boards in Australia, particularly the boards of our large listed public companies, of course, has been under scrutiny, is always under scrutiny. Most recently, of course, with the Hayne Royal Commission, we heard lots of discussion during the hearings of the Royal Commission about how boards were being overwhelmed with a tidal wave of information, that perhaps being on a board of one of these large listed public companies is becoming so complicated. Can we actually expect people to do a good job when they're looking at board packs that might be literally in the thousands of pages? So one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight in the session is how AI can help boards to deal with that complexity and the volume of information. Now, with us tonight, we have two expert presenters who've been thinking about AI and corporations and corporate law for some time. Our first presenter is Dr. Akshaya Kamalnath from Auckland University of Technology, where she's a lecturer. Her teaching and research is in the area of corporate law, corporate governance and corporate insolvency law, and she maintains a regular online blog on these topics, which is called The Hitchhikers Guide to Corporate Governance, which I've been following for some time. So welcome, Akshaya. Our second presenter is James North. James is the Head of Technology, Media and Telecommunications at Cause Chambers Westgarth here in Sydney, where he advises some of the world's most innovative and best-known technology brands and is a long-term advisor to large Australian telecommunications companies. So we'll start off with Akshaya, who's going to talk about a paper that she published recently looking at this specific topic of boards and AI, and then we'll pass over to James, and then there'll be time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. Now, if you do have any questions for the presenters, if I could ask you to type those into your Q&A button, and that way we can deal with those questions at the end of the session. So I'll now pass over to you, Akshaya. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jason. I'm just trying to share my slides. Oh.
So I've got a copy of your slides if there's any issue there, Akshaya.
I think I'm in.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so thanks again. I'm very glad to virtually be sharing this paper with everyone. As my sorry, give me a minute. Okay, so my paper is entitled "The Perennial Quest for Board Independence: Artificial Intelligence to the Rescue." And as the title suggests, I've come at this topic from the direction of researching on boards, board independence, board failures, etc., and then found my way to artificial intelligence rather than the other way around. I've also been parallelly, I did a separate piece of research on how AI was being used in the medical context. So this paper has been a kind of fun amalgamation of my various research interests. So I'll start by talking about why, when we think of why or how AI can help boards become more effective, we need to look at what our expectations from the corporate board is in the first place. So Jason mentioned lots of information being a problem, but even before getting to problems being experienced, problems boards are experienced, I want to take one step back and look at what roles we expect from our from the boards of our large listed companies. So historically, outside directors on boards played a more the kind of signaling role. So you have someone providing access to certain networks on the board that encouraged investors to come in. We haven't completely done away with this role. We still have board directors providing access to political networks, certain sectors, certain networks to certain sectors, etc. That's one role. We also have an advisory role for boards in smaller companies. With the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen boards of larger companies also get involved in a kind of strategy and guidance role. But my real focus is going to be on the monitoring role of the board, which in large listed companies is the reality, because as outside directors, they're not involved in day-to-day operations. So rather we expect board directors to be monitors of management. And this role comes from, has its basis in the agency theory, which basically expects board of directors to ensure that managers who are acting as agents of shareholders as per that theory actually act in the interests of shareholders and the company rather than in their own interests. And so that's the basis for the monitoring role of the board. We also have, in common law, directors have fiduciary duties to the company. We have statutory duties of duty of care, duty of loyalty, all of which are there to ensure that the board of directors can function in such a way as to prevent or mitigate agency costs. We also have a range of corporate governance principles, listing, stock exchange listing rules, other soft law mechanisms, all of which are going into this area of ensuring boards can monitor management. And the key point there that all these different types of legal mechanisms are trying to, and the means by which they're trying to ensure board effectiveness is by ensuring that the board is independent of management. So almost every country has laws or listing rules to say that directors in large listed companies should, at least a majority of directors should be independent of management. So if we're having a lot of this focus on independent directors on boards, we run into the problems of boards not having functioned so well, despite having had all these rules, requirements. A lot of these companies had a lot of companies post the global financial crisis, and even now closer to our current time, the Banking Royal Commission shows that there was a lot of misconduct and problems that boards didn't handle very well, despite having independent directors as required. So, and this is not totally new to us. Since the GFC, scholars have been talking about how boards have not been able to function in the best way or in the manner intended when we have all these independent director requirements. So the first problem is the issue of having too much information or an information overload. So in one of the studies I'd looked at, interviewed directors, and one of the directors said they see reams and reams of information. So it just shows the kind of frustration with the large volume of information they need to deal with. And of course, when we're talking about this too much information problem, we think of ASIC versus Healy, where the judgment itself referred to crucial information being buried in the middle of large board information packs given to the board, so that it wasn't easy to spot. And this problem arises because as outside directors, they're not involved in the daily management of the company. They're just getting informed by the board packs given to them by management. The second problem is that despite having all these independent directors as per the rules, they're not functioning, or they're not able to truly function as independent directors. So there's a lot of literature after the GFC looking at Enron, talking about how very intelligent, reputed directors on the board did not counter certain courses of actions, didn't suggest alternate courses of actions, etc. So, and a concept in psychology a term proposed by Irving Janis, groupthink, applies very well to boards. Basically, groupthink is a mode of thinking that people engage in when they're deeply involved in a cohesive in-group, when the members' strivings for unanimity override their motivation to realistically apprise alternative courses of action. Now, what better cohesive in-group than a board of directors, right? Because this is a high-esteemed group of professionals that possibly belong to the same social and professional networks. So it's probably very almost an unconscious kind of feeling to get along and not rock the boat too much, not disagree with their colleagues. So this idea of boards not being able to function independently has existed, and people have looked for solutions for both these problems. So I'll go over a few solutions that has been out there, and then talk about my solution of artificial intelligence, and whether that can be part of the range of solutions we have to make boards more effective. There's been a recent study from Stanford scholars on the Netflix approach to governance, which talks about how too much information problem is kind of remedied. They've had independent directors sit in quietly on as non-participating members of management discussions of various operations teams, so that they're well aware of what's happening in the company, and they're not really reliant on that one big fat board pack before a board meeting. But again, Netflix isn't such a big company, so whether this model works for very large companies is it's probably not likely to work. But that's one question. That's one solution on the menu. Delaware's Vice Chancellor Laster has suggested, talking about groupthink, he suggested that the first thing is to simply increase awareness amongst board members that this is a problem, and once they're aware of the problem, they may seek to address it better. So that, I mean, by now we've had a lot of awareness about groupthink, so I'm not sure how much that has helped. The other big solution being spoken about is diversity. While we've probably all heard about gender diversity on boards, diversity more broadly in terms of backgrounds, educational backgrounds, geographical backgrounds, etc., may have the added advantage of having directors come from different networks, so they don't feel the same kind of obligation not to disagree or ask a question or suggest an alternative. But again, I'm not sure that's absolutely foolproof, because there's also literature suggesting that directors who don't belong to similar networks in the beginning may, over a period of time, develop what is known as fictive friendships. And so again, they get into the groupthink issue. And of course, you have the hypothetical solution from Professors Bainbridge and Henderson about simply outsourcing the board to external service providers like law firms, audit firms. That hasn't yet happened, but it's out there on the menu of solutions. When I speak of artificial intelligence, that hasn't happened in the corporate governance arena. We've had some headlines being made in Hong Kong of a AI director being appointed to the board, but not too much more. So I'll talk about how I think AI can help, and then I'll explore a little bit of how AI has worked in a certain healthcare context and draw from that in my proposal for corporate boards. So the first thing is, we've heard a lot about AI getting itself being biased because its program being biased. So sure, that is a possibility, but if there is no bias programmed into the system, then AI isn't susceptible to human biases like groupthink. So an AI isn't afraid of upsetting its friend on the board, for example. So that's one advantage. And the way we could imagine this working is that having the same information being fed into the AI system, directors who are unable to find these important pieces of information kind of lost in a large board package, maybe the AI will pick it up as something different from the general pattern of information. The other thing is, after having processed the information, the AI may suggest a solution, and that may be a completely different or alternative course of action from what the CEO is suggesting. So if directors are so afflicted by groupthink that they don't want to challenge the CEO, they always have the excuse of saying that, look, the AI has suggested it, we need to discuss this alternative solution. So there's at least that way it helps with dissent and discussion of alternative courses of actions. And and of course, I'm still within my model, I still have a place for directors to think about the AI's recommendation and to decide on whether that's a good recommendation or not. So let's look at how this is being used in the healthcare context. I've specifically looked at IBM Watson that's developed an AI system for oncology, and I looked at some material from Manipal Hospital in India, which has started using AI. So generally, when they have a cancer patient come to them, and they need to decide on a course of treatment, you have a group of oncologists, just like a group of directors, sitting together to make the decision. And apparently, from interviews that I've seen of those doctors, apparently they take 1 or 2 days to make this decision. So they each go by, so there's a list of factors they all discuss, and they each go by their own personal experiences. And the AI is simply one other member of this group. It doesn't take 2 days, it takes about 2 minutes to provide its recommendation. And then the doctors decide, they also consider the recommendation of the AI. Now, what's interesting about that AI system is that it provides a list of treatment in order of priority, and for each of the treatments, each of the course of action, it provides reasons. So it bases its recommendations on medical studies. So the doctors can look at it and discuss whether that's relevant or not. If it's completely wrong, they can discard it. And in fact, IBM Watson itself has found certain errors in the AI system, so it's not infallible, even in other areas where it's being used. So when we think of it coming on to boards, we should be ready for the AI making mistakes at the beginning, in the beginning. So in my model of integrating AI into corporate governance, I favor a system quite similar to what's being used in the medical profession in oncology. And I say that it's not possible at the moment to completely replace human directors with AI, because there are various issues within corporate law, or various points within corporate law which contemplates directors to exercise their judgment in ways that the law doesn't already have answers to before the fact. So it's very difficult to program all of this into the system. For instance, this big debate about should stakeholders be prioritized, should stakeholder interests be taken into consideration at all, it would all depend on the situation and which stakeholders to prioritize. All of that, we need human directors assessing these situations as they come, because it's almost impossible to program that before the fact. Similarly, the business judgment rule, both in the US and Australia, contemplates some space for directors to have entrepreneurial flair, business flair, and make decisions that can't be, the court doesn't want to second guess. So there is some amount of business instincts. There's a lot of cases in Australia where judges have kind of emphasized this. So I don't see directors completely being replaced by AI, but having AI give this sort of directors the comfort of providing them, picking up issues they don't pick up in huge board packets, also providing them an alternative course of action, I think is already a huge game changer. But I think I've also kind of highlighted certain issues that we need to keep in mind before happily selling AI to boards. The first thing is that we need to think about what information is relevant to board decision making. In cancer research, it's easy to put in a lot of the medical studies on cancer. With boards, I'd expect it to be different for every companies in different sectors. So would it be the AI developer like IBM that's deciding these issues, or would it be companies? There's also the issue of information security, because if we're putting all the confidential information into the AI system, that the information that's given to directors, then it's open to hacking and cyber attacks, which we've seen so much in the news lately. So unless you have very good information security in place, and the AI providers can promise this, companies should ward against just jumping into starting to use AI. And the other thing I want to emphasize is, and this is what a lot of scholars have warned against, that is black box decision making. When AI provides decisions without telling us the reason for those decisions, we need to worry about then how do we simply expect directors to blindly follow that decision. So just like how IBM Watson is providing the basis for the treatment recommendations, I'd expect there to be, or for companies as clients of AI to insist on having that as a necessity within the AI system. And finally, we need to also guard against bias seeping into the AI, because the way an AI system works is it learns based on experience. So if it sees that a bunch of companies in this sector have made certain decisions, the AI system learns that that kind of decision is good. Or if it sees the company's management always making certain decisions, then the AI system learns that it's good and does not pick it up as a problem. So we need technology officers always checking for this. There's also a chance, because the technology officers or the CTO probably reports to the CEO. So again, it comes into the issue of board independence, right? Because the technology officers could probably ensure that where management is motivated to conceal bad information from independent directors, the technology officers could well collaborate with such management. So some sort of gatekeeping type rules should be devised for technology officers working on this, which I haven't proposed in this paper, and I hope to do in the future. And finally, and these are the kind of considerations that I'm pointing out for the current state of play in artificial intelligence and bringing AI onto the board. But if we do go into a situation where we have sophisticated enough artificial intelligence systems where we can completely replace the human board of directors with an AI system, then we need to rethink most of our corporate law, because they're based on fiduciary duties, based on judgments for human directors. So even when we give legal personality, or if we give legal personality for AI, we need to think through how corporate law needs to change. So that's really not part of what I've proposed, but that's something that I want to kind of caution at the end, and say that without thinking through those things for changes that corporate law needs to make, we can't completely discard human directors from the board. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. So if you could just unshare your screen or stop sharing.
Okay.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And I'll go back to our generic share. Thanks very much, Akshaya. And for those who are interested, Akshaya's paper is available in the Albany Law Review, and you can also find a copy of it on the SSRN database online, which is a database of scholarly papers. So that's raised a lot of issues, which hopefully we'll have some time to discuss. There have been a couple of questions, but I might just leave those till the end. And I might throw over to James now, if you can tell us about your experience actually working with boards and how AI is being used inside major companies.
Thanks, Jason. So as Jason mentioned, I lead the tech practice at Course, and we advise a mixture of clients on technology. Some of them are big tech companies, global tech companies, who develop AI, and then there are large listed Australian companies like banks, telecommunications, who are starting to use AI in their businesses. So I thought today I would talk a little bit about how we're seeing AI used within business in Australia, and I'd also, and I'll go through some of the use cases that we see, and I'll also talk a little bit about the legal risks of using AI, particularly in the boardroom. So firstly, I would say, Akshaya mentioned the Hong Kong company that reportedly appointed a robot to its board. That was a company called Deep Learning Ventures, and it made a lot of press. But in my experience, that vision of a robot director using AI and deep learning to make governance decisions is not really a reality, at least not yet, and not within our client base. Where we see AI being used, it is what we call narrow AI. So it's not general AI using neural networks or deep learning. It's narrow AI. It's built for a specific function. And so one example that is increasingly common in the financial services industry is AI being used by a bank to analyze transaction banking data and to assist, if not completely make credit decisions for customers. That's an example of narrow AI built for a specific purpose. And in my experience, I'm not a data scientist, but at this stage, AI lacks the ability to make, or the capacity to make judgments in a way a human director would. So I think that vision of a robot director may come true one day, but certainly not true at this stage. Where we do see AI being used, it's mostly not by boards, but by executives within a company. And that's still relevant because those AI tools are informing recommendations made by executives to boards. And it's important that boards understand and are aware when AI is being used to inform those recommendations. So a few use cases that we've seen recently within our clients. So an agricultural company using weather and soil data to predict crop yields and then make labour hire decisions based on the predictions developed by the AI tool. We do a lot of work in the telecommunications space, and it's quite common for telecommunications network companies to analyse the vast amount of data that go across their networks. And they're using that now to determine the optimal network capacity and then make procurement decisions accordingly. because if you over specify a telecommunications network, you can waste a lot of money. It's increasingly used in cyber, so some of our clients are using AI to analyse their internet connections to identify unusual activity that may indicate a cyber attack. And one particularly interesting use of AI that we saw with one of the PE companies, private equity companies, using what's called a sentiment analysis to analyse the sentiment of employees and customers at a target company, compare that to industry benchmarks, and work out whether there are culture issues in the target company. And so it's just that informs their investment decisions as part of due diligence. So at least at this stage, in my experience, most of these use cases are AI tools being used by executive management to inform recommendations to boards rather than being used by boards directly. But I do see over time AI being used more and more by boards, and that's simply going to be a necessity because, as Akshaya mentioned, the internet is increasingly generating enormous amounts of data that just really can't be usefully comprehended without AI tools. And that's only going to accelerate with things like the Internet of Things, 5G networks. So more and more data, we need more and more data science and AI tools to make meaningful use of that data. And I do think it's an interesting concept that you mentioned, that AI could start to be used by boards to test the recommendations of management. So you've got this situation where management says yes, but the robot says no. And that might be a situation where the board says, well, your recommendation doesn't really stack up with the data. We think you should go away and do some more work on that before we pass a board resolution to support that recommendation. And it is, as Akshaya mentioned, an interesting source of independent data that could be used to manage what we call agency risk. So I think that's they're all interesting possibilities. In our experience, that's simply we're not there yet. I would say for any directors out there or anyone advising boards of directors, it's important that they understand that there is legal risk involved in using AI. And so, as you're probably all aware, directors are legally obligated to act with reasonable care and diligence, and that standard is going to apply to any governance decision informed by the use of AI, as it would for any other decision. There are safe harbours available to protect directors from personal liability, including the reliance rule under Section 189 of the Corps Act. So directors can rely on the advice or information from an employee or expert or another director, but they must act in good faith in doing so, and most importantly, they must undertake an independent assessment of the information. And so similarly, the business judgment rule requires directors to inform him or herself as to the subject matter to the extent reasonably appropriate. So what I would take from that is, a director that is presented with a recommendation that's based on AI from management, or a director that is using AI to make a decision, simply can't accept it that it's correct at face value because it is generated using AI. And I see that as a really significant practical risk, because here in particular in Australia, we have a lack of technology skills on boards. And so you have the risk of what's called automation bias, which is the tendency of people to assume that something produced by technology is correct. And that is a significant risk. And therefore, advisors to directors and directors to themselves have to be particularly aware of that risk and careful using AI, because there are increasing number of examples of flawed AI decision-making processes. So, for example, a number of large companies were using AI for recruitment decisions, and then it was discovered that the AI produced recommendations that were biased against minority groups and potentially in breach of anti-discrimination laws. And that was not because the AI algorithm was flawed, but simply because the data set that was being used reflected a biased or discriminatory society. And the AI tool was simply reinforcing that bias. So the assumption that AI is always correct is wrong. Errors in AI can result from many different things, from flawed algorithmic design, because the data set is biased, as I mentioned, or it's simply too narrow. And that's an issue in Australia. We do not, many companies within the Australian business environment simply don't have enough data to produce useful AI. Another example of something where AI can go wrong is where the AI program is hacked due to external malfeasance or internal malfeasance, and that produces an incorrect result. So I would recommend that anyone who is using AI, particularly in the boardroom, takes steps to verify its reliability. And that includes reviewing the design of the algorithms, making sure the data sets are sufficiently broad and appropriate, testing and observing the results of an AI tool before it's used in production. So going back to my banking example, some of the banks we work with are using AI for creditworthiness assessment, but they're also using their traditional human-based credit assessments in parallel with the AI tool. And in some cases, it may not be appropriate to use AI as the single sort of input into a decision. It may only be safe to use it, as one factor in a decision-making process. And that is particularly true where there is potential for a breach of human rights. So you may be aware that the Australian Human Rights Commission is preparing a report to the Commonwealth Government on technology and human rights, and they are particularly focused on AI. And their concern is that the use of AI without an appropriate ethical framework could lead to a breach of human rights. And so you may have been aware, if you've been following the news, that Microsoft and Amazon have decided that they will withdraw their facial recognition AI tools from US police departments, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. And there are allegations that some of those tools are, like the recruitment tool I mentioned before, biased against minorities, and hence their decision to suspend use until they can be proved to be able to be used safely. And even at a more basic level, there are ethical suggestions or principles being developed, ethical frameworks that go to really basic things like, if you're a consumer that's applying for credit and the bank says no, there is a proposal that you as a consumer ought to be told if AI was used in that decision. And that principle is actually being legislated in Europe into the GDPR. And secondly, that the company ought to be able to explain the decision if they used AI, and that is a challenge in itself. So definitely my recommendation would be, there's enormous possibilities with AI. I think, some of these things will take time to be useful in the boardroom, but definitely consider the legal and ethical risks in using AI in your corporation, and also whether it's aligned with your corporate values. So that's all I had to say. Jason, I might hand back to you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, James, for giving us an insight into how AI is being used in different ways in Australian corporations. That's fantastic timing because we've now got about 15, 20 minutes for some general discussion and some questions. We've had a couple of questions come up. I've also got some questions for the presenters as well, but perhaps if we can start with Samar's question, who asks, this is for you, Akshaya, could you please clarify what you mean by the Netflix approach?
So the Netflix approach is just having directors more involved, independent directors more involved in operational issues. So what they do is different operational teams, not the CEO, but just below that layer of management. When they have their team meetings, they allow independent directors to sit in, not participate, but sit in on them so that they're not only relying on information from the CEO. So this is just to ensure that independent directors are better informed and not waiting for that huge board pack. But again, Netflix isn't as big a company, so I'm not sure the much larger companies can follow this. How many independent directors would be willing to spend that kind of time, etc.?
Yep. So if I can build on that question, actually, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the board's 3.0 model that Gordon and Gilson out of Columbia have proposed.
No, I haven't.
Oh, okay. Oh, I really commend their paper to you. It's published in the Business Lawyer Journal. There's actually a special issue in the US Business Lawyer Journal from last year, I think it was. And the special issue, I can send you the details. The special issue is all about new models of corporate governance for boards. So Bainbridge and Henderson present a cut down version of their board service provider model in that issue, and then there's a critique of that from some other articles. Anyway, the Gordon and Gilson model, which they say is just the start of their analysis of this issue. We're still waiting on a fuller paper. Their paper's about 10 pages or so. But basically they say that maybe what we should be looking at, this I think very much follows on from this Netflix approach, is trying to deal with the information asymmetry problems and the independence problems that we have with boards of directors versus management. That really we should be looking for a new model beyond the monitoring board, which is very much focused more like a private equity board model over a portfolio company, where the directors are almost, they're not part of management, but they're almost embedded in with management. So they've got access to all the same information, and they would have a much greater role in generating independent information and basically sitting there watching what management is doing much more closely than just at the monthly board meeting and on the respective committee meetings. So, I mean, this is just a general comment from me, but I think it's really interesting for us to think about whether the monitoring board model is still, I guess, achievable for these large publicly listed companies. I mean, we expect them to be monitoring what management is doing. Some of these companies are enormous enterprises with tens of thousands of employees and literally millions and millions of documents and data points. To expect anyone to be across that and hold management to account, I think, is questionable as to whether that actually works. And of course, in the Bainbridge and Henderson book, Outsourcing the Board, which was published last year, where they look at their board service provider model, essentially a separate entity whose job it is to be a director of the company. That's one of the big issues that they try to deal with. Why are we getting, 10 or 12 real people who have bounded rationality, who come with their own inherent sets of biases and backgrounds? Why are we asking them to try and really be superhumans, to try and be robots? Now, I can see that there would be some in the audience who would say, well, the law doesn't really do that. The law recognizes that, it's not an ideal director that we're assessing them against. It's at least insofar as Australian law, I'm sure New Zealand law is the same, but it's a reasonable person in a similar position, in a similar type of company with a similar sort of responsibility and role. So the law doesn't require them to be perfect. People can make mistakes. That doesn't mean that they're liable. But I think this is a really interesting time, because I don't know anyone who can read 2,000 pages before a board pack. Before a board meeting and actually digest it all. Now, of course, we have to rely on what it is that management is providing So it's interesting for us to be grappling with these issues. Maybe the monitoring board role, which really came about from the 1950s onwards, and the role of institutional investors in corporate governance, maybe that monitoring board role isn't the best fit anymore. And that's something I'd like to explore. So I don't know, sorry, I've kind of been ranting for a couple of minutes there, but I find this really interesting, and I just wonder what your take on that is. Is this where we can use technology to produce better decisions, hopefully?
I think that's interesting, but I kind of disagree. I'm still a fan of the monitoring model, even though and we need to use technology, whether it's straight away AI or lesser forms of technology, to help them digest that information. But I think the real problem is also that usually you'll have, in normal situations, you have this huge board pack that directors have to read, but in crisis situations is when directors end up meeting much more, and it's these crisis situations when directors have to respond to a lot of information in a short period of time. So it is part of the job. I think the answer is to have directors hold less number of board positions. Right now they hold a lot of board positions, and there is I think executive search firms have a big role to play in the hiring of independent directors in future. And if they can kind of pick out talent from diverse networks, I think the monitoring role I still have faith in the monitoring role.
And I just note there that Peter says in the comments, well, you know, Warren Buffett can do it. Peter, I'm not sure how much of an argument that is. If we're holding up Warren Buffett as the standard for which all directors are to be assessed against, I think we're going to have problems there. So just having another look through the questions there. Gary asked a question early on during the presentation, which to a certain extent James dealt with in his discussion about directors' technical knowledge, and is it sufficient to enable them to use AI. I guess one point I'd add to that is the Australian Institute of Company Directors did a survey of their members last year in conjunction with the Sydney University Business School, where they looked at their members' experience and attitudes towards innovation. I just think it was interesting that one of the stats that came out of that was that only 35% of their respondents said that their particular board had the right skills and experience to assess both the ethical and the practical implications of modern technology. So to a certain extent, Gary, I think that answers your question, that a lot of directors don't. One of the things that the literature certainly says to us is that just appointing a designated director who's got knowledge and expertise in AI or technology, while that might be better than the current approach if the majority of directors don't have that type of knowledge and expertise, just appointing a designated person who's expected to then carry the board's knowledge with technology issues, I'm not sure that that's the right approach to go for either. If we're saying that technology can help directors deal with the mountain of information that they're being presented with, help them to do their job better, I'm not sure that trying to designate one of the directors is the right way to go. And certainly, I mean, from a general corporate law, corporate governance perspective, we've moved well beyond that, looking at, say, financial matters. You know, it's no longer appropriate, at least for the last 20 years, to say, well, I didn't need to read the financial statements because we had Bill over here and he's a former CFO, so he would tell me if something went wrong. And of course, Akshaya, yes, sorry, James.
It's not consistent with each director's obligation to make an independent assessment of the advice or the decision. You know, to have one director in charge of technology decisions. So I totally agree with you. I think the problem in Australia is the lack of directors with technology skills is just a reflection of the makeup of the Australian economy. Until recently, we have not had a very strong tech sector, and that's changing, I think. But that means you have very few available directors who've run a technology company, who've been a CEO of a technology company, and therefore are in a position to sit on a board and supervise executive management in a technology sector. I think that's changing, but it is a real problem. we've seen that problem in cyber as well. I mean, cyber is a massive issue for all Australian companies, and it's only going to become more significant as time goes on. And that, you know, for boards to understand that issue and supervise executive management on that issue is, without an understanding of technology, is really challenging.
Yeah, I also think.
Sorry. Yep. No, go ahead.
The AICD and the Institute of Directors in New Zealand, these bodies have a role to play in increasing tech competence. We've all learned a lot of technology in a hurry now after the COVID-19 struck. So I think it can be done.
So just going back to the questions, thanks for everyone who submitted a question. So R&R says, how would ethics be incorporated? How can we balance complex priorities such as community impact versus financial metrics? And perhaps if I can offer a comment there, and then fellow presenters if they want to add anything to that. But R&R, I think the answer to that is that if boards get the ethics of technology and the ethics of AI wrong, then we've seen that the market will punish them. And by the market, I don't just mean the capital markets, but rather the customer markets, the product markets, because we've seen companies absolutely hammered where they have failed, for example, to protect their customers' data, have been subject to hacks. So this is something that boards have to get across. They have to include this as part of their balancing exercise of the different priorities that they need to assess. As to how you operationalize that, it's going to be different for every company, surely.
Yeah, I agree. And this is the reason I don't think we can completely hand off decision-making to AI, because this balancing act can't be programmed before the fact.
Yep. I mean, one of the comments that I had just coming out of the presentation and really thinking about how AI can help in terms of dealing with the devil in the detail of these huge board packs. I mean, one of the concerns that I have is, how is this going to feed into the liability framework for directors? So at the moment, we've talked about how directors have statutory obligations, general law obligations, that they need to be, you know, reasonably informed, as you mentioned, James, to the extent that they reasonably believe to be necessary in terms of the statutory business judgment rule. Are we going to reach a point, have we already reached a point where we might say, well, the board is negligent because they have failed to consider AI? And then how is that going to work in terms of the competency and also the financial resources of boards?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility or a probability in the medium to longer term, because, you know, the information is out there, and if the directors fail to take account of it, you know, surely there's at least in theory, a case for negligence there. So I don't think, I think for now, directors have some time to skill up on this, but I think inevitably they're going to have to start be competent in AI and use big data in their decision making. So I just don't see any other alternative.
I also think companies should make this decision about whether they have enough resources to invest in AI. And that again is about how we have questions now about companies donating to certain charities and causes while they're laying off employees. So it's also about deciding based on the resources they have. But in the context of lawyers practicing, I think I've seen some discussion in the US about lawyers being ethically obliged to use the best technology available. So probably we could have that in theory, but it would depend on costs.
Yeah, and I mean, thankfully, the decision about how to manage the company's financial resources is protected by the general law business judgment rule, as long as directors are making that decision and they're not tainted by self-interest and you know, bad faith. So they do get that degree of protection there. Gary makes an interesting point. Gary says, does this mean that the boards are going to need a majority of millennial directors so that they can get across the technology?
And that feeds into the point about board diversity needing to be many faceted and not just gender diversity. We need to look at all these forms of diversity. But again, I don't think it's past older people to pick up technology.
Sorry, I'm just answering a question on there. Okay, we've got a question from Ulysses. So Ulysses asks, who owns and manages the data and the AI itself? Is this the company's or the board's or management's responsibility?
That's an interesting question. So typically, in our experience, AI tools are developed by the big tech companies. There are some Australian organisations that are trying to develop AI themselves, but mostly it's outsourced. So you're buying a piece of software just like you're buying, you know, Microsoft Windows or something. And that creates issues in itself, because when you're trying to understand how the AI works and potentially explain the outcomes, you're dealing with a trade secret of a supplier. So Akshaya mentioned the black box of AI, and that's partly the reason for it, because a lot of AI is proprietary, confidential information of a supplier. In terms of the data, you know, a data set, as long as sufficient work has been put into compiling it, can be protected by intellectual property. So if a company develops a data set, the company will own the copyright in that data set, and it's potentially protected as confidential information as well. One of the challenges that Australian companies have, I mentioned, is that unlike Google or Amazon or Facebook or Tencent or Alibaba, they just don't generate enough data to make AI useful. And so what we're seeing is a lot of Australian companies sharing data with each other, and that needs to be documented through some sort of license arrangement to protect the owner of the data set's rights.
Yeah, I wonder if we get into some competition law issues there, James.
Yes, yes. I mean, there's always been a tension between competition law and intellectual property. You know, that's there's always been a tension there, and you also see some policy moves made for competition reasons to make data sets available to third parties to promote competition. So a good example of that is the consumer data right, which has been implemented in the financial services industry, which basically makes the big banks share data with fintechs to ensure that data is not sort of warehoused and used to prevent competition. So yes, data is very much at the heart of competition policy in the future, I think.
Sorry, I was just answering a question there. So Ulysses asked a follow-up question. The minutes of the board meeting are effectively owned by the chair and the board. So how does the AI data set sit in that context?
I actually have thought about this issue in terms of, so for a different paper, I had looked at board decisions from Delaware to look at, to kind of find out what went wrong with the company, to get the story behind the issue. And a lot of times the story comes partly from the minutes, partly from cross-examinations, etc. So if you have an AI recommendation sitting there, when the case goes to court, will along with cross-examinations, they look at emails sent by directors to each other, to management, etc. So will there be a question of the court asking for, tell us what the AI recommendation was, tell us why did you consider it, what did you say after that? So I think that will become an issue if it's used, and so if they use AI and they simply don't consider its recommendations, that would be a problem.
Okay, I'm just mindful of the time here, so we might draw things to a close there. This, as I said at the start, this is a huge topic. It covers a whole range of areas. I'd just like to thank our presenters tonight, Dr. Kamalnath from Auckland University of Technology and James North from Course Chambers Westgarth. Thanks so much for sharing your insights on this fascinating topic for us tonight.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Jason.
Thanks, James.
Okay, so just for the attendees, a copy of the slides will be sent around, so we'll send that to all the people who registered, and look out for the next in our series of Ross Parsons Centre webinars. Thanks everyone for giving up your time tonight.